Well, good morning to my grandchildren. It's another nice day. It's nice here where we're at Grandpa's house, and the weather's nice. The weather's warm and the sun's bright today. It's Monday, and I missed reading to you yesterday because yesterday was Sunday and I was pretty busy all day long um, doing God's work. But anyway, it's important to spend some time with you, and I wanted to spend a little time with you today and read another chapter in our book, The Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder. And it's about Laura's memories as she was growing up in the little house in Wisconsin about 150 years ago. So anyway, this chapter is entitled The Harvest, and we'll begin reading now. Pa and Uncle Henry traded work. When the grain got ripe in the fields, Uncle Henry would come and work with Pa, and Aunt Polly and all the cousins would come and spend the day, and then Pa would go and help Uncle Henry cut his grain, and Ma took Laura and Mary and little Carrie to spend the day with Aunt Polly. Ma and Aunt Polly worked in the house, and all the cousins played together in the yard till dinner time. Aunt Polly's yard was a fine yard to play in, because the stumps were so thick. The cousins played jumping from one stump to the next stump without ever touching the ground. Even Laura, who was the littlest, could do this pretty easily in the places where the smaller trees were grown close together. Cousin Charlie was a big boy, going on 11 years old now, and he could jump from stump to stump to stump all over the yard. The smaller stumps he could jump two at a time. He could walk on top of the rail of the fence without even being afraid. Pa and Uncle Henry were out in the field cutting the oats with their cradles. A cradle was a sharp steel blade that was fastened to a framework of wooden slats that caught and held the stalks of the grain when the blade had cut them. And Pa and Uncle Henry carried the cradles by their big, long, curved handles, and swung the blades into the standing oats. And when they had cut enough to make a pile, then they slid the cut stalks off the slats and into neat heaps on the ground. Here's a picture of a man with a cradle swinging that. How would you like to swing that all day long to get enough oats to put away for the winter? Well, that's how they did it. And here's a picture of them gathering up the sheaves, getting ready to make bundles. It was hard work, walking all around and around the field in the hot sun, and with both hands swinging the heavy cradles into the grain and cutting it, then sliding it into piles. And after all the grain was cut, they must go over the field again. This time, they would stoop over each pile, and taking up a handful of the stalks in each hand, they would knot them together to make a longer strand, and then gathering up the pile of grain in their arms, they would bind it tightly around them with the band that they had made and tie the band and tuck in its ends. After they had made seven such bundles, then the bundles needed to be shocked. To make a shock, they stood 5 bundles upright together, snugly one to one, and with the oat heads up. Then over these they put 2 more bundles, spreading out the stalks to make a little roof and a shelter for the 5 bundles from the dew and the rain. Every stalk of the cut grain must always be safely in the shock before dark, for lying on the dewy ground all night would spoil the grain. Pa and Uncle Henry were working very hard because the air was so heavy and so hot and still that they expected it to rain. The oats were ripe, and if they were not cut and in the shock before rain came, the crop would be lost. Then Uncle Henry's horses would be hungry all winter. At noon, Pa and Uncle Henry came into the house. They were in a great hurry. They swallowed their dinner as quickly as they could, and Uncle Henry said that Charlie must go help them in the afternoon. Laura just looked at Pa when Uncle Henry said that. At home, she'd heard Pa say to Ma that until Uncle Henry and Aunt Polly spoiled Charlie. When Paul was 11 years old, he had done a good day's work every day in the fields, driving the team, but Charlie didn't do hardly any work at all. Now Uncle Henry said that Charlie must come to the field. He could save them a great deal of time. He could go to the spring for water, and he could fetch them the water jug whenever they needed a drink. And he could fetch the whetstone when the blades needed to be sharpened. And all the children just looked at Charlie, and Charlie did not want to go to the field. He wanted to stay in the yard and play, but of course he did not say so. Pa and Uncle Henry did not rest at all. They ate in a hurry and went right back to work, and Charlie went with them. Now Mary was the oldest, and she wanted to play quiet, ladylike play. So in the afternoon, the cousins made a playhouse in the yard, and the stumps were chairs and tables and stoves, and leaves were dishes, and sticks were children. And on the way home that night, Laura and Mary heard Pa tell Ma what happened in the field. Instead of helping Pa and Uncle Henry, Charlie was making trouble all he could. He got in their way so they couldn't swing the cradles. He hid the whetstone so they had to look for it when the blades needed to be sharpened. And he didn't even bring the water jug till Uncle Henry shouted at him 3 or 4 times. Then he was all sullen about it. After that, he followed them around, talking and asking questions. They were working too hard to pay attention to him, so they finally just told him to go away and not bother them anymore. But they dropped their cradles and ran to him across the field when they heard him scream. The woods were all around the field, and there were snakes in the oats. When they got to Charlie, there was nothing wrong. He laughed at them, and he said, "Ha ha, I fooled you that time." Pa said if he had been Uncle Henry, he would have tanned that boy's hide for him, right then and there. But Uncle Henry did not do it. So they took a drink of water and went back to work. 3 times Charlie screamed, and they ran to him as fast as they could each time. And he laughed and laughed. It was so funny. He thought it was a good joke. And still, Uncle Henry did not tan his hide. Then a 4th time he screamed louder than ever, and Pa and Uncle Henry just looked at him. He was jumping up and down and screaming, and they saw nothing wrong with him, so they'd been fooled so many times they just went on with their work. Charlie kept on screaming louder and shriller, and Pa did not say anything, but Uncle Henry said, "Let him scream. There's nothing wrong." So they went on working, and they just let him scream. He kept on jumping up and down and screaming. He did not stop. At last Uncle Henry said, "Well, maybe something really is wrong with the boy." So they laid down their cradles and went across the field to him, and all that time Charlie had been jumping up and down on a yellow jacket's nest. The yellow jackets lived in a nest in the ground, and Charlie had stepped on it by mistake, and then all the little bees in their bright yellow jackets came swarming out with their red-hot stingers, and they hurt Charlie so that he couldn't get away. He was jumping up and down, and hundreds of bees were stinging him all over. They were stinging his face and his hands and his neck and his nose. They were crawling up his pants leg and stinging, and crawling down the back of his neck and stinging. And all the more he jumped and screamed, the harder they stung. And Pa and Uncle Henry took him by the arms and ran him away from the yellow jackets. Then they undressed him, and his clothes were full of yellow jackets, and their stings were swelling up all over him. They killed the bees that were stinging him, and they shook out the bees out of his clothes. Then they dressed him again and sent him to the house. Laura and Mary and the cousins were playing quietly in the yard when they heard a loud blubbering cry. Charlie came bawling into the yard, and his face was so swollen that the tears could hardly squeeze out of his eyes. His hands were puffed up, and his neck was puffed out, and his cheeks were big and hard, and there were puffs all over his body. His fingers stood out stiff and swollen, and there were little hard white dents all over his puffed out face and neck. And Laura and Mary and the cousins just stood and looked at him. They didn't know what to do. Ma and Aunt Polly came running out of the house and asked him what was the matter, and Charlie blubbered and bawled, and Ma said it was yellow jackets, and she ran to the garden and got a big pan of earth. And then Aunt Polly took Charlie into the house and undressed him, and they made a big pan full of mud and plastered him all over with it, and they rolled him up in an old sheet and put him to bed. His eyes were swollen shut, and his nose was a funny shape, and Ma and Aunt Polly covered his whole face with mud and tied the mud on with cloths. Only the end of his nose and his mouth that was showed. Here's a picture of Charlie in bed, all wrapped up in sheets with all his yellow jacket stings. Aunt Polly steeped some herbs to give him for his fever, and Laura and Mary and the cousins stood around for some time just a-looking at him. It was a dark that night when Pa and Uncle Henry finally came home from the field, and all the oats were in the shock, and now the rain could come, and it would do no harm. Pa could not stay to supper. He had to get home and do the milking. The cows were already waiting at home, and when the cows are not milked on time, they do not give us much milk. So he hitched up quickly and got us all into the wagon. Pa was very tired, and his hands ached so bad that he could hardly drive the wagon very well, but the horses knew the way home. Ma sat down beside him with baby Carrie on her lap, and Laura and Mary sat on the board behind them, and they heard Pa tell about what Charlie had done. Laura and Mary were horrified. They were often naughty themselves, but they had never imagined that anyone could be as naughty as Charlie had been. He hadn't worked to help to save the oats. He hadn't minded his father quickly when his father spoke to him. He had bothered Pa and Uncle Henry when they were hard at work. And then Pa told about the Yellow Jacket's nest, and he said it served the little liar right. Well, after she was in the trundle bed that night, Laura lay and listened to the rain drumming down on the roof and streaming off the eaves, and she thought about what Pa had said. She thought about what the Yellow Jackets had done to Charlie. She thought it served Charlie right, too. Served him right because he'd been so monstrously naughty. And then the bees had a right to sting him because he was jumping up and down on their home. She didn't understand why Pa had called him a liar. She didn't understand how Charlie could be a liar when he hadn't said anything. And that's the end of the story about the harvest. And Charlie got into a lot of trouble, didn't he? He got in trouble with the bees because he had made fun of his Pa and his uncle and done things that he shouldn't have done, caused him all kinds of trouble, and I think that's why Pa called him a liar. Well, anyway, I hope you kids learned something from each of our stories. All this happened a long time ago, and boy, did they have to work hard just to get some oats in and have some oats for their horses and cattle and to eat. But it's good that they were able to do some things, and I hope you learned some things from how things were and are grateful for all the life that you get to live with your mommies and daddies here today. Well, I'll see you next time. Bye.